Good evening. In a few moments, I'll be taking questions. If you would like to line up at any time during my presentation, you are welcome to do so. My name is Josh Straub, and I'm the editor-in-chief at D.A.G.E.R. We are a consumer education and consulting agency focused on physical accessibility for the disabled. I've worked on some of the industry's top games. I've worked on Uncharted, God of War, Fortnite, just to name a couple. And do you know what I'm thinking? Why am I here? None of the games that I've worked on are VR. It's true that if you want to know the basic steps any developer can take to make a product more accessible, I can help. But VR offers two unique challenges because it makes two assumptions about the consumer during the design process. The first assumption is regarding the user's mobility. Even if you're making a static experience, you're making an assumption about the user. Either that the user prefers to be static, or that being static somehow helps the experience. Obviously, if you make a game that requires mobility, you're going to run into accessibility problems. I can't use VR that requires mobility because I'm driving a 300-pound wheelchair, and I can end up breaking someone or something if I'm not aware of my surroundings. The other assumption that VR makes that you need to be aware of is regarding the user's position. If you have an experience that requires a certain position, standing, crouching, ducking to use, you're gonna run into accessibility issues there as well. So the critical question that you have to ask yourself is, what assumptions am I making about the physical capabilities of the user? And how can I change those assumptions to be more accessible? In addition to that question, there are 4 principles of good game design that actually apply well to VR when you're talking about accessibility. The first is flexibility. Flexibility is really the heart of accessible design, because when you make a game or a product that caters to somebody's need of access, you also make a game that flexes to somebody else's preferences. For the game industry, I use the example of QuickTime events. Lots of players don't like QuickTime events, but when a developer chooses to make a game where the QuickTime events are optional, they're not only meeting the preferences of the core audience, they're also meeting the physical requirements of gamers who just can't access those sorts of experiences and inputs. So that's flexibility. The second principle is a forgiving nature. Nobody wants to retread the same ground over and over again. You need to be aware that failure in VR is inevitable. There are going to be users that break your experiences in ways you never thought possible. And you need to understand that this is going to happen more with non-standard users, disabled users, than with standard users. And so what you need to account for is when they fail, when they reach that fail state, they don't have to retread the same ground over and over and over again. You need to make the game forgiving, or the experience forgiving, either by letting them restart exactly where they failed, or if you're making a game, by allowing them to save anywhere. That way they're not punished for doing something, or for not doing something that when their body just gives out and they're not able to accomplish the task that you've set before them. The third principle is actually really simple. It's quality. In order for accessibility to matter, the product being made accessible must be good. Again, to go back to my experience in the gaming industry, I tell developers this: the only thing worse than a good game you can't play is a bad game you can. Nobody wants to waste their time with bad games or bad VR. So quality really matters, because if the quality is not there, the accessibility doesn't matter. And it's also important to know that if you feel like there's a set of features or an accessibility option that lowers the quality of your experience, don't include it. VR accounts for an enormous amount of diversity, and part of that diversity makes room for games that are and experiences that are just inherently inaccessible. The final principle of good game accessibility that applies well to VR is the idea of visibility. And to illustrate this, it's really important, really good to look at the case study of Uncharted 4 Among Thieves. No, it's not a VR game, but it's a perfect illustration. That game, because of the work they did with daggers, was the first one to feature a dedicated accessibility menu. It's important to realize that the more visible your accessibility features are, the more usable they are. A lot of disabled users will go into your products expecting to be excluded, and if they cannot find accessibility features quickly and easily, they're just going to assume that you didn't include them. And so make your VR accessibility options obvious, and that'll make it more accessible. So really quick, I want to review. You can just shout at me as I ask these questions. What are the two assumptions that VR makes regarding the consumer? Come on. Mobility and what's the other one? Come on. Positioning. Mobility and positioning. And what are the 4 principles of good game accessibility that apply to VR? Okay? Yeah? And to quality and good. Good. You're all getting there. Alright, so in addition to that, I also know probably better than most of the people in this room why it's important to make VR accessible. The first is sort of obvious. It's the financial argument. There are 50 million disabled consumers out there, and many of them want to play VR experiences. I'll let you do the math about how that can affect your bottom line, but the bottom line is accessibility equals flexibility, and flexibility sells products. The second one is actually much more personal, and to be honest, I was a VR skeptic. I received my first VR headset. It was a demo unit of the PS VR from Sony about a year ago, and when I strapped that thing on my face, it's gonna sound really trite, but it was a transformative experience. And I wasn't even doing anything. I was simply walking through a museum, and yet I was walking. It felt like I wasn't even in my chair. It felt like I had accomplished a lifelong goal of traveling to the Middle East. That's the power of VR. You can actually use it to enrich the lives of disabled people who have extremely limited social and cultural interaction. And isn't that sort of the holy grail of emerging technology? To impact someone so much that you actually change their worldview? Well, that's the power of VR when made properly accessible. To put it another way, if any of you are familiar with the book The Voyage of the Dawn Treader by C.S. Lewis, anybody here read the book or seen the movie? Yeah. Well, in that book, there's a magic painting that sucks 3 children from post-war England into a magical world, away from the austerity and the uncertainty of all the rationing and all the rebuilding of the Second World War, and into a magical world of fantasy, talking mice, lost princes, and so forth. And at the end of the book, they come back out of that painting, and they're better able to cope with the realities of the real world through the escape they just made. I wanna close my segment with a quote that I've co-opted that's actually from Ursula Le Guin, but I've changed it to apply to VR. VR is escapist, and that is its glory. If we value freedom of the mind and soul, if we are partisans of liberty, then our duty is clear: to escape and take as many people as possible with us. Thank you. Any questions? Questions? There's a mic in the middle of the room. Anybody got any questions? Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks for the talk. I was actually super excited you guys are having this talk because I totally missed out last GDC for the accessibility talk. So my question for you is that oftentimes like part of the challenge developers has is that we really want to improve accessibility, but what does that actually mean in actual practice? So do you have any like easy guideline to think about like trying to use the control in both hands, or trying to imagine like you have a limited degree of freedom in terms of movement. What are the quick exercises do you recommend to the like developers?
Well, to be honest, VR offers a unique challenge because it assumes that anything you do in VR, you're already able to do in the real world. So the Rift, unfortunately, with the touch controls, is inherently inaccessible. Unfortunately, because VR is not my specialty, I can't give you a list of specific VR best practices, but there are lots of guidelines online for general software accessibility and for game accessibility. One of the best is by a man by the name of Ian Hamilton, who compiled a list at GameAccessibilityGuidelines.com, and that would be something that I would recommend that anybody checks out, especially if you're making a game, but even if you're just making a VR experience, because it will make the it'll answer your question in much more detail than I can.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks for that talk. It's very enlightening. And could you tell us what was the most accessible VR experience that you've tried and why?
Well, I don't do a lot of VR because it's pretty inherently inaccessible. But I would have to say most of the accessible ones are not actually games. They're experiences. So walking through that museum, or there was I forget the name of it, but there was sort of a mini documentary on the history of aviation in the PlayStation VR, where it actually had you looking at and interacting with various planes throughout the 100 years that man has been flying. And it's usually static experiences like that don't incorporate a lot of controls that end up being de facto more accessible.
And just to follow up to that, do you think you would use VR more if there were more accessible experiences?
Absolutely.
Great.
Absolutely.
Cool. Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, then again, thank you, and I will yield the rest of the time to Ben and Hannah.
Thanks, Josh.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you so much, Josh, for setting up this conversation. My name is Hannah Gillis, and this is Ben Peck. We are from Lucasfilm's ILMxLAB, and we've spent a lot of time now developing VR, and specifically this last year, diving in specifically to accessibility design in VR, how we can improve, and we're really happy to share our lessons learned with you today. For a quick overview of what we'll be discussing, we will start with our Trials on Tatooine origin story, the thing that really brought us into accessibility discussions. Then we're going to go through a quick overview of accessibility before VR, so non-VR game guidelines. Then we want to dive into new areas of inspiration that we've identified for this new medium, followed by a VR accessibility survey that we actually executed and analyzed and want to share with you today. And we'll finish with, in practice, a new experience called Meet BB-8, where we were actually able to infuse a lot of the lessons learned from an accessibility standpoint. Quick background on the two of us. I am a project manager at ILMxLAB. XLab is specifically oriented around Star Wars real-time technology. So whether that's immersive cinema, virtual reality, augmented reality, theme parks, any other cool innovations that we can come with to make Star Wars even more awesome. Ben is an engineer in that same group, and together with our team, Kevin, who's here, and other people back at the studio, we are constantly doing rapid prototyping and iteration on next generation of immersive entertainment. So let's get into what brought us here today. We created Trials on Tatooine, which was ILMxLAB's first foray into real-time rendered virtual reality. It was a room-scale experience, and it lasted about 7 minutes long, depending on how you interacted. And it allowed the guest a few different types of interactivity, including the opportunity to repair the Millennium Falcon, defend it from stormtroopers, and even wield a lightsaber. For those of you who might be unfamiliar or need a refresher, here's a quick video. We took Trials on Tatooine to Star Wars Celebration in 2016. This is essentially a 3-day galactic Comic-Con. A lot of people come to it. And it was also our biggest VR installation to date. We actually created 20 VR booths that allowed over 2,500 people to come through and experience that very nostalgic Star Wars planet of Tatooine over the course of these 3 days. That being said, it was by far our biggest playtest and exposure, our most diverse audience that we had ever shared Trials on Tatooine with. And in that sense, it was by far the most humbling experience in regard to accessibility.
Thanks, Hannah. Right, so if anyone in the room is familiar with what it's like to take a tech demo and bring it to a conference and have it tested with a live audience, what could go wrong? Well, some things did go wrong, and some things went right. And so I want to go over, with respect to accessibility, what went right, what we tried to account for in advance and worked out, and then I'll go over the things that we missed. So varying adult standing height. We realized, in the section of the experience where you have to grab a section of the Millennium Falcon and pull it down to the ground, we want to make sure that no matter what your standing height was, you could comfortably reach up and grab that handle. So we have 3 discrete levels at which the handle initially falls to based on how high the HMD is from the floor. We also accounted for Deuteranopla, or color blindness. So this actually came out of a member of our team calling this out during our development, during playtesting. And so Han Solo, during the experience, berates you, as he often does, and he asks you to press a red button, press a green button, press all the buttons. Well, certain people may have trouble discerning between red and green, so we made sure to add an additional visual signal, in this case, having those lights blink, just to make sure people can discern those 2 buttons. Another feature we added that we're pretty happy with is having the ability to toggle between a speaker setup and a headphone setup. we partnered with Skywalker Sound to create Trials on Tatooine, so we have amazing sound. When the Falcon lands on top of you, the bass, if you have a surround sound system, really shakes the room and really adds to the visual experience of Trials on Tatooine. However, we realized that a majority of people at home are probably going to want to play with headphones because that's just how their setup is. So we made sure to do the technical work to make sure those two types of audio setups work. But a nice side effect of this after the fact when we started researching accessibility was we learned that certain people with hearing aids, when they put on headphones, especially over-the-ear ones, can get a lot of unpleasant feedback and scratching. So this is a really great alternative for people who don't want to use headphones and can just use their speaker setup. Central to the design of Trials on Tatooine was that it was a lot of people's first-time VR experience. So we wanted to make the controls very simple. So it's a one-handed experience. There's no required button presses on the controller. And this also was nice because, yeah, like your classic lightsaber technique involves two hands. So we wanted people to kind of fulfill that fantasy. But this also has, again, really good, interesting side effects where at Celebration we had someone with a cane come through, and so one of their hands was taken by the cane, but they were still able to experience Trials on Tatooine, or people with crutches or people with limited mobility in one of their hands were still able to comfortably play Trials on Tatooine. So there was definitely some things that we missed, and just to put it bluntly, we didn't consider accessibility outside of our own internal biases as a development team. Most notably, we had a very cathartic experience when we had our first guest come through who was in a wheelchair. So we suddenly realized all these accessibility issues that we'd missed, such as seated reach height and depth. As I spoke earlier, there's that handle that you have to grab. We did not take into account or playtest what it would be like to grab that handle from a seated position in terms of comfort. So that could have easily been solved by cursory research or playtesting. Seated sightlines are drastically different in our experience. So right now I'm playing Trials on Tatooine in a seat. And as you can see, nearly half of my field of view is obstructed by these barrels and crates in front of me. And then you'll notice as I stand up, my field of view is drastically different. And this is the blocking, this is the layout that we were basing our development around. As you can see, more projectiles are approaching me from this point of view. They're not getting hit by barrels on the way. So I'm actually engaging with the mechanics more. I'm having more fun from this vantage point. So that's something we need to take into account. But all in all, it was a really positive experience for us. In particular, I want to talk about one. We had a caretaker of a guest with multiple severe conditions that affected them both physically and cognitively write us an email. And this guest, in the email, they described how this guest had an incredible time playing Trials on Tatooine, and now they want a VR system of their own. And the guest was performing motions in Trials on Tatooine that were usually reserved for things they had to do during their physical therapy. And this physical therapy can be very boring or painful. And the guest was just having fun doing it, not even noticing. So this email was a huge inspiration to us, and just was basically our call to action. We want to do better. We want to think of these things earlier and enable these types of experiences for our guests more going forward.
Before we dive into the new areas of inspiration that we can talk about specifically with VR and that we discovered, we do want to take a really important moment to acknowledge the resources that are available and were available to us already. Speaking to one of the Q&As for Josh's section, this is a good things that we found useful. First, we turn to the GDC Vault for a number of different videos and talks that you can refer to. These are just a handful of what we really benefited from. And then we also really enjoyed and found a lot of benefit from the GameAccessibilityGuidelines.com website. This actually covers a variety of different impairments, including motor, cognitive, vision, hearing, and speech. and it actually talks about how to address these different areas on a level of basic, intermediate, and advanced. So please do visit those sites and others to get a head start. From there, we want to talk about the new areas that we identified.
So shortly after Trials on Tatooine, I went home and I thought about, who else has thought of these problems? Architecture quickly came to mind. So I want to talk about how architecture as a field approaches spatial planning, specifically with respect to accessibility. So there's this resource, probably at your local library reference section, called the Americans with Disabilities Act and Architectural Barriers Act Accessibility Guidelines, or ADA-ABA-AG, as I like to say. This resource is wonderful, and it's filled with diagrams such as these. I highly recommend everyone to just go and flip through this in an afternoon and then maybe go back and look at it in more detail. But as you can see, there's actual specific numbers and examples of how to design spaces that are accessible and comfortable for as many people as possible. Another really great architectural resource is residential remodeling and universal design. This one is a bit more example-based than the previous one, so it goes through specific cases that you would encounter in a residence and just goes through and identifies what are the common barriers in a given situation, in this case, a residential entrance. They then go through and propose either complete resolutions or ways to mitigate those barriers. And I've highlighted in blue some of these fixes that I think also would apply to a VR space. They've added a light above the door so you can see what's going on. They've placed a shelf next to the door, so maybe you're carrying something and you want to open that door first. You can put the object down, open the door, and pick it back up again. These are just really interesting things to kind of see how they could translate to making a virtual world accessible as well. And lastly, for architecture, someone we spoke with, Chris Downey, was incredibly informative. So Chris Downey is an architect who happens to be blind. And Chris likes to emphasize that when we are designing physical spaces, we need to engage people along a multiplicity of the senses, so not just sight. Doing this lowers the overall cognitive load of the space and allows people to perceive that space more quickly. So you could, for example, you could think of like a water feature placed near the entrance of a building. You can hear that feature and you can kind of tell without looking where I should be headed. So those kinds of things are just good universal design and helps everyone, not just those with sensory impairments.
We also recognize that being part of the Disney umbrella gives us a lot of incredible access into some of our sister departments within Disney. So that might include, specifically in this case, the Disney theme parks. Quick side note, we also found a lot of benefit from speaking with Disney animation, film, and general set and game design is a great place to look for inspiration as well. Each year, millions and millions of people attend these theme parks, making it one of the most diverse playing fields for this type of research that you could imagine. Disney is recognized for having a very unwavering commitment to inclusivity in the parks, and they're able to do that in two specific ways that I'll go into. Also, Disney and we and society has ever-increasing expectations for accessibility. Every year that bar gets higher. And so this is also a discussion of how you can look into the future and improve upon the past to ensure that you're keeping up with those expectations. So the first way that they're able to be inclusive is through communication. Whether it's through the DisneyWorld.com website, which has a very exhaustive list of FAQs, whether it's through social networking, blogs, word of mouth, social media, on-site mobile apps. You can even walk into the park, go to the town hall, and there's a guidebook that depicts all the different rides and all the different accessibility features of those rides. We really feel like providing this level of information is what actually removes a barrier to entry, allowing the guests to have the most enjoyment during that day at the parks. The second big factor is agency. So specifically throughout the park, they have opportunities for guests to actually physically practice transferring in and out of a ride vehicle before necessarily committing to the queue. This is a huge deal because it allows people to actually, for themselves, establish what their level of comfort might be, especially in time-sensitive situations where these rides cycle out within seconds. Additionally, there's a lot of signage for these rides and an internal network with Disney's own employees who have varying levels of ability and can speak firsthand to their guests about what might be the most comfortable situation. So these two factors, communication and agency, come together to create a feeling of self-selection for the visitor. How can we do this in VR? We really believe that advocating for unified storefronts, common language about what categories of accessibility might exist, how we might label our experiences, would be a really big step forward. Additionally, we believe in demos or limited trials so that people can actually get into the VR experiences that we're developing and they can decide for themselves, is this something that I want to purchase and invest my own time and money into?
Great, so next I'd like to talk a bit about a survey that we conducted that was gathering information about people's experience in VR with respect to accessibility. So for this survey, we partnered and worked very closely with Alice Wong at the Disability Visibility Project and basically just sought out individuals who self-identify as having a disability and sought their opinions, their feedback, just direct feedback for developers. So we had 79 participants in this survey, and as you can see on the left, these participants use VR very frequently. They're a very big part of the VR audience. And as you can see on the right, all of our participants identified as having at least one disability. So here we go. Yeah, so we had 79 participants reporting 98 disabilities, and on the right are the 7 most common conditions reported. So it's a very diverse group of conditions, and you can see many of the categories from the Game Accessibility Guidelines website that Hannah mentioned before. They're all represented here, so cognitive, motor, vision, hearing. Here's a graph of the top 8 responses to a question asking what activities are difficult to perform in VR. So yes, obviously at the top, things related to physical locomotion of the body. But also at the bottom, you have some interesting insights with respect to sensitivity to light. So as you can imagine, if you have sensitivity to light, putting a headset on for the first time is probably a very jarring experience. I'd now like to read some direct quotes from our participants as they relate to specific subjects. So for standing, room-scale VR experience makers don't always design for seated users. Even seated experiences in VR don't take reach differences into account. So that was certainly something Charles and Tatooine was guilty of. Locomotion. The Vive is hard to use because I have to hold controllers and push my wheelchair around at the same time. It's hard to turn. Easy to bump into walls, even with chaperone, because my radius is wider. One of the most interesting things we learned about in the survey was learning about the different workarounds and hacks that participants are doing to get around the barriers that they're experiencing. So in this particular instance, we had a participant unable to read text in VR. So they would take the headset off, open up the Windows magnifier feature in Windows, look at their computer monitor, and then go put their headset back on and go back to what they were doing. So clearly that's a very bad user experience and something that we need to improve. And now here's just some summaries of requests and suggestions. So alternative to motion controls, adjustable UI and text size, tourism modes with no blockers or fail states. So Josh touched on that as well. Being able to experience your content from start to finish is really important to everybody. And so you need to make sure that everyone can experience it without getting unnecessarily blocked by barriers. And lastly, don't lock out adaptive software and hardware. So as I just said, people have a very interesting toolbox that they use to get around the barriers that they experience in everyday life, and they've been building that up for years and decades. So don't go out of your way to make it more difficult for people and lock out the software they're using or the hardware they're using. So I'm very happy to announce that we're going to be sharing a report that we wrote up based on this survey. available now. So yeah, please take a screenshot of this URL. We'll be posting it to social media as well. But yeah, it's a really informative paper if you'd care to read it. It's over 30 pages of just results. It's great. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you for going and reading it. We're not.
So taking all of that, the most fruitful part of this journey has without a doubt being able to pull it all together and put it into a new VR experience that we worked on this year called Meet BB-8. Meet BB-8 is another room scale experience, and it's flexible in duration. It can be as short as you want it to be, it can be as long as you want it to be. And really, it was an effort in character exploration. So much like Trials on Tatooine was our research on how to make it really feel like you're in a Star Wars universe, a Star Wars planet, how can we make it feel like you're really meeting one of your favorite Star Wars droids, BB-8? So there's a few different levels of interaction here as well. BB-8 will come in his classic fashion, peeking out of a corner, and he can imitate you if you move side to side. He can chase a laser pointer on the controller, kind of like a cat. And he can also have a really magical moment where if you crouch down, he will come up to you and allow you to actually pet him, snuggle him, give him some scratches on the chin. We took some of our lessons learned from Trials and some of the new ones as well, right off the bat, including making this a one-handed controller experience. That's all that's required. There's actually no required button presses. It's all optional in order to get through the experience. You can pull the trigger if you want to engage the laser pointer. And best of all, there's no locomotion required. Part of the magic is that BB-8 always stays within your point of view, your line of sight. And it's great because then he's looking at you. You really feel like he cares about you and recognizes you. But it also it means that he's not going behind you and you don't have to chase him. Additionally, we strive to make BB-8 very cognitively accessible. So unlike some of the other experiences that we'd worked on or seen, where there's a lot of heavy action, heavy story happening, this is very light. It's very low intensity. It's completely self-paced. You're in a room and you're with this character and it's all driven by how you want to experience it. You can do the different interactions in whatever order you want and for however long you want, or not at all. It's completely up to you. One of the most magical parts of everything coming together was, again, taking this experience to Star Wars Celebration in 2017, a few months ago. We had the opportunity to share it with about 400 guests of all different diversities, and a couple came up to us. He was fully standing, and she was seated in a wheelchair. He went through the experience first. He ran through all of the different interactions with BB-8, including the moment where you crouch down, BB-8 comes up to you, and you give him that scratch on the chin. We then switched out participants, allowing our guest in a wheelchair to come through, and Ben walked her through how you too can have BB-8 come up to you by tapping on the controller. This is BB-8's signal that rather than crouching down, tap on the controller, he'll come, and you can scratch BB-8 as well. And so as we're going through this experience, watching her go through the experience, the man leans over to me and notices that she didn't have to crouch down for that moment. And he asks if we thought about accessibility before we made the experience, while we made the experience. It wasn't just an afterthought. And being able to look him squarely in the eye and honestly tell him that we did think about it, and see how appreciative he was of that, of having that equal experience with her, that is the moment that made all of this worth it. So we hope to make many, many more moments like that, and we really hope that sharing what we've learned with you today, we can all make more moments like that. That's really what we want to send home. With that, there was still a few more lessons learned, always room for improvement.
So it was no surprise that we were going to get a diverse crowd that would come through our booth. But it's also no surprise that we would continue to learn new lessons from putting a diverse audience through VR experiences. So here we go. Yeah, so in particular, we discovered that all the flaws in our height detection code were quickly exposed by this diverse group. So we had, in particular, a situation where a tall individual would go through and play the experience, and then a shorter person would go through, and that would create side effects for that person. And so we ended up having to do hard restarts, broke up the flow of the booth. We realized a pretty good lesson for QA. So instead of just looking at testing individual people in your VR experiences, make sure you also look at how a diverse sequence of users, one after the other, will also affect your QA problems. Another lesson was the usefulness of operator controls. So they played a big part in ensuring a smooth experience for our guests in our demo. So operator controls being someone at a keyboard for watching the guests play and having keyboard and be able to trigger things manually. So for example, that motion control alternative that Hannah mentioned earlier, that was also toggleable by the operator using a keystroke on the keyboard. We could also control the length of the demo. So if someone's not having a good time or getting bored, we can change the duration, tune it specifically to the user. So beyond the scope of demos, operator controls are also very useful to developers as a tool to experiment with what you want your ideal experience to look like for people. In practice, you'll observe how, when, and why you use these controls to intervene, and then you can use this information to identify what future work, what future features you can build to remove reliance on these operator controls, and then improve the overall quality of accessibility in your product.
So in conclusion, we really know now that there's a lot of different areas that you can pull from in order to make your experiences more accessible. Whether it's through architecture and taking into account spatial planning for the physicality of VR, or theme parks really engaging in effective communication, agency, making opportunities for people to self-select and opt into your experience. Or whether it's through your design, testing, observing, and responding to what these situations might be. And then, of course, through surveys, asking, getting that feedback. We really want to stress that we believe this is a continuation of the conversation around accessibility. And much like the multidisciplinary nature of this new medium, so is this conversation, and so is it together that we can keep on improving inclusivity and making more universal experiences overall. Here are some of the resources that we found really useful. Here's one more link to our accessibility survey and the results. And a huge thank you to everybody who helped get us here today. A huge thank you to Josh and Oculus for having us here. We could not have done it without you.
Thank you.